right? Gerbil wheel. So the best way to create a goal. The best way is to know your donor retention rate, and fabulous, 2/3 of you know that, and your average gift size. For the 1/3 of you who don't know your current donor retention rate, I'm going to go so far as to say it is the very first thing you must address. So right after this webinar, sit down and start to calculate what your donor retention rate is. And I literally mean yet this afternoon, tomorrow. It is that critical of a piece of data that will make, if you're not analyzing that right now, if you're not building budgets based on that right now, it'll be the biggest gift that I could give you, is to tell you about that. And so why? Why is donor retention rate and average gift size so important? Because if you raise $40,000 in year one and your CFO says, okay, next year you got to raise $50,000, it is not a growth of $10,000 in new money. Rather, it's a growth of $10,000 plus the amount lost in donor attrition. So what does that mean? If you have a 90% donor retention rate, that means you need to raise $14,000. If you have a 60% donor retention rate, that means you need to raise $26,000, which is a dramatic difference and will greatly impact your success. If you don't know that you have a 60% donor retention rate, and I can also tell you from the research, there's the Fundraising Effectiveness Project. They actually estimate that most organizations have like a 39 or 40% donor retention rate. If you don't know that and you're frustrated because you feel like you're constantly working as hard and as fast as you can, well, here's why. Because you didn't need to raise another 10 or even another 14. You needed to raise another 26. And so this is where the math comes in, and this is where the show your work. If your board and your executive director and your CFO understood this math, then you would have a dramatically different budget scenario. So, okay, I have to raise now all this money, but what does that mean in new donors? And so this is where the average gift size comes in. If the average gift for your organization with a 60% retention rate is $500, that means you need 52 new donors at that average gift size. So I like to, when I run these numbers, I like to say to my client, okay, do you know 52 people who can give you $500? Well, if your average gift size is $75, that means you need 357 new donors. Again, a huge difference that's going to impact your ability to be a successful fundraiser. So you can turn to your team and say, okay, do we know 357 people who can give us $75? And so that's why this math is so important. I just did this exercise with a client who has a decent average gift size, but a poor donor retention rate. And we went through these numbers, and I posed those questions to them. And they all looked around the room at one another, and they said, no, we don't think that this is feasible. And so it was a powerful moment, but it was also an empowering moment, because then everybody felt like, okay, we have a new way to look at this, and now we have some tools as we build next year's budget. So when you're thinking about average gift and using these tools to build next year's budget, don't forget the average gift size and retention rates for new donors is always less than your current or renewed donors. So your retention rate for a first-year donor, so I'm Kerri, I give to your organization for the first time this year. The odds of me giving to you again next year are not so good. First-year donor retention rate is usually quite low. But if I do give to you a second time, the odds of me giving again are much higher. So as you get more sophisticated in calculating your retention rates, you're going to want to have a separate retention rate for first-year donors than you have for donors who've given at least once before, so for renewing donors. Average gift, too. So someone who is renewing, who's giving to your organization a couple of, this year, last year, this year, next year, their average gift size always, and not 100%, right? Nothing is ever 100%, but more often than not, and almost always, is a lesser dollar amount than a renewing donor. So the first year I might give you $25. If I give to you again, it may be because I'm learning more about your mission and your impact, and subsequent gifts are maybe 50 or 75. I believe, and I'm going to say, I'm going to assume most of you on this call have heard about the chronic turnover of development professionals, right? All of the data says the average development director lasts only 18 months on the job. And in my experience, I think this chronic turnover and frustration is very much related to this whole exercise. They were told they needed to raise 50 instead of 40, and no one helped them understand what that truly meant. And then they worked really, really hard, but didn't hit that number. And I don't know if that resonates with many of you, but I really see that so very often, and it's a shame because this is preventable frustration. So what does it look like to put this into a spreadsheet? This, oops, I'm sorry. I moved my mouse and I moved everything. Sorry. This is the spreadsheet that is in the handouts that can be downloaded. So we're going to say your goal is $50,000. So how many donors gave in FY14? So across the columns to the right, 300 donors. That number stays static. So we're always starting with a baseline of X number of donors, and in this illustration, it's 300. Okay, so what's your donor retention rate? In the first column, it's 70%. Well, if we have a 70% donor retention rate, that means 210 of our 300 donors are going to give again. The average gift of last year's donors was $125. That means you can expect from renewals $26,250. Your goal is $50,000. So how much is left to be raised? It's $50,000 minus the $26,250, and that means you need to raise $23,750. If the average gift of your new donors is $75, that means you need 317 donors to give you $75 to hit that goal. The second column, okay, let's play with this. What if we change our donor retention rate? Well, the only thing that changes in the second column is donor retention moves from 70 to 90%. Well, at 90%, 270 donors renew. Average gift is still $125. That means total renewal is $33,750. You have $16,250 left to get to your goal. At $75, then it's 217 new donors. Well, what if our donor retention rate is only 50%? That's the third column. At 50%, you're only going to get 150 donors to renew, times that average gift. You're only going to get $18,750 from renewals, which means the amount left to be raised is a whopping $31,000. With an average gift for new donors of 75, that means you need 417 people. That is a huge difference. The next three columns are going to say, okay, well, what if we keep donor retention rate static? And that's at 80%. But what we're going to vary in these next three columns is the average gift size. So 80% donor retention rate means 240 donors give again. If the average from the gifts, the renewing donors' gifts is $100, you're going to raise $24,000. You have $26,000 left to raise. If the average gift of new donors is 75, that's 347 new people. That's more new people than your current base of 300. And the second to the last column to the right, again, average or retention rate stays at 80%, 240 donors renew, but this time the average gift of last year's donors is $300. Well, 240 times 300 is 72,000. You've just blown your goal away. You've raised $22,000 over the goal amount. And so we never want to have a budget that is too hard to reach. It's not achievable. But we don't want to have a budget that is so conservative that we blow the numbers out of the water. And why is that? Because we really want a budget that's accurate. If you blow the numbers out of the water one year, what are the factors that led to that? And then are you going to be expected to repeat it again? So maybe there was an anomaly. Maybe a couple donors gave a lot more than you expected. Or maybe it's in this case, the estimate was just so low, knowing your data, knowing your average gift last year was $300, then you would have budgeted a better number. The very last column, the average gift for those 240 renewing donors at 200 means you get to 48,000. You only have 2,000 left to go, and at $75 for the new donors, you only have to find 27 donors. So, well, Christy, we can pause here for a second and ask anyone if they have a question about this, because this spreadsheet is really at the heart of how to budget for fundraising success. And I want everyone to really understand what we did here so that you can use that spreadsheet template when we're done with this call and as you plan for next fiscal year. So are there any questions right now that anyone wants to pose?
You have a question box in your webinar control panel. You may also be able to unmute yourself in your control panel.
We'll let you think for a minute and see if someone posts a question. This spreadsheet is really a powerful tool. I encourage you to do this. So the very first column, why don't you plug in your actual retention rate, your actual average gift sizes, and say to your board and your finance team and your leadership team, okay, here's what our numbers look like. Here's how we break it down. And then use the columns to the right to vary retention rate, vary average gift size, so that you can show them how these numbers fluctuate. It really is a powerful tool.
Yeah.
And as you get used to using this type of a spreadsheet, I always encourage you to use this for different giving categories. So have one for your corporate donors, have one for your foundation grants, have one for your special event donors. And then for individual giving, you can break it down by major donors, middle level donors, lower dollar level donors, because there's going to be variances between those different donor categories. So as you get comfortable slicing and dicing these numbers, I encourage you to then get even more sophisticated and use these spreadsheets for the different types of donors and the different level of donors.
Hey, Kerri, we have some questions that have been posed. One I can answer. One is, can they have the spreadsheet? And the answer is yes. It's actually been uploaded under the handout tab in the control panel, and I will send it out again when we send out the recording and the follow-up materials to the webinar. So yes, you will have this tool to use because it is really helpful. I have personally found, Kerri, thank you for sharing with me years ago. Let's see, there are a couple of questions. I think I'll maybe hold some to the end, but maybe take a couple now, Kerri. How do you determine the formula for the donor retention rate?
So that's a great question. So if you're using a fundraising software program, and it doesn't have to be Razor's Edge, just about any fundraising software program, there are canned reports and there are canned tools. And so you can ask your software program to run that report and tell you what your retention rate is. So the first simplest answer is look at the software that you're currently using and see what type of retention rate tools it has, because it'll crunch the numbers for you. The second way is a kind of an old school way that you take, you download into a spreadsheet all of your donors and do it over the last, say, 4 years. So in the spreadsheet, you would have a column to the left with all your donor names, and the columns to the right would say FY13, FY14, FY15, FY16, with their giving level in those columns. And you literally just crunch the numbers. You insert a column in between, and you calculate how many donors go from FY12 to FY13, and then you do the math. And then you look at the columns of donors, how many donors went from were giving in FY13, gave again in FY14. And it takes a little bit of time, but once you get the hang of it, it's easy to crunch that. And so the first thing you want to look at is donors who gave in FY14, did they give again in FY15? And then as you get more comfortable doing this, then you can get really sophisticated. You can say, okay, donors who gave in FY13, if we lost them in FY14, did we pick them up again in FY15? Or donors who gave in FY12, how many of them have been kept over the 4 years to FY16? But to start very simply, see what kind of canned reports your database has, because most fundraising databases can pull this for you. And if your database doesn't have that, or if you're still managing everything in Excel and you don't have a database, you literally download everything and you calculate from one fiscal year to the next.
Yeah, great. So Kerri, there are several questions about how to calculate donor retention and what to do if you don't use software. So I feel like you've covered really, really many of those. There's one here about if you're real small, there may be some real small folks online. I think you've kind of hit that with even if you're using Excel, kind of start there.
Right. Even if you're using, even if you're using Post-it notes and index cards, right? You don't have to have a very fancy software program to do this. You literally say, who is everyone who gave in FY14? Who is everyone who gave in FY15? How many of the donors gave in 14, gave again in 15? And that's how you crunch the numbers that way.
Yep.
So it can be on a piece of paper. You can print off everybody from your donor list in 14, print off everybody in your donor list in 15, and calculate how many gave. So it doesn't have to be fancy. It's literally measuring. If they gave in year 1, did they give again in year 2?
Great. So this one's a little bit different. Yeah, there's one more, Kerri, and if you want to hold it today, that's okay. But this one's about actual donor retention. So fairly new organization, we likely have some donors who are excited to help us, quote, start out. How do we ensure we retain those donors, and how can we accurately project what their future donations might be?
Well, if you're a fairly new nonprofit, I'm assuming you don't have multiple years of giving history. So it's a little harder to predict because you don't have a lot of history to analyze. But the best advice I can give you is, well, we've all heard the phrase when it comes to real estate, location, 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 right? So the phrase I'm going to give you is engagement, engagement, engagement. How are you engaging those donors? If you're new and they're excited about you being new and they want to help you launch and fulfill your vision and be a founding donor, there's a ton of energy and enthusiasm around that because it really is a special moment in time. Do not assume that you will continue to get gifts if you are not engaging them and building relationships with them. So I have a colleague in Cleveland who said to me that a donor said to her, I'm tired of feeling like an ATM because this donor only heard from this certain nonprofit every time they needed money. And you have to remember that the most successful fundraising is relationship-based. It is not transactional. So this spreadsheet looks pretty transactional because we're doing the math and we're calculating. But the work of fundraising has to be relationship-based. And so you have to make sure you're sharing the impact of the work that you do, that you're thanking your donors, that you're letting them know that their gift has made a difference. And when you do that, you're going to build donor loyalty. And so it absolutely has to be about engagement and stewardship and meaningful thank yous. And even if you feel like your organization is in a cash crunch, your case for support is never, ever, ever, never, never, ever, never that you need money. Because that's transactional, and the donor feels like an ATM, and they might give you that money out at the outset because you need it, but you may never hear from them again. So I promise you, if you spend time on building relationships, engaging your donors in the mission and vision of your work, and authentically and meaningfully saying thank you, your donor retention rate will skyrocket.
Great. Thanks, Kerri. So those are the questions on that. I'll just say again, these are posted under the handout tab. This particular spreadsheet is called OIC Goals Spreadsheet. I saw a couple comments about difficulty opening it. I'll send it to you at the end. as an attachment, so you'll have it, and hopefully you can open in Excel and use it. The other two pieces are reports and articles that Kerri thinks are really helpful for all of us. So that's what's in the handout tab. All right, back to you, Kerri.
Okay, so I mentioned this briefly. As you get comfortable with this spreadsheet, I want you to have a spreadsheet for individuals, corporations, foundations, special events, even in-kind gifts, if that's a significant portion of your budget. Each of those categories should have their own analysis because the retention rate and the average gifts are going to vary. And then again, once you get comfortable, you'll break it down even further between major donors, new donors, members, first-year donors, renewing donors. You'll start to love this tool, and you'll be slicing and dicing and analyzing in a multiple ways. But I don't want you to get worried at the outset, like, oh, that sounds too complicated. Just start very simply by having one spreadsheet for individuals and one for corporate, right? Like, just start there, or just start with the one for individuals. You'll be amazed at how easy it is once you start doing it. So we talked about donor retention rate and average gift size. The other area that we can talk about is probability, and this really comes into play for foundation and corporate budgets. And and also these reports. So to give you some benchmarking, and Chrissy just referenced these reports in the handouts. Nonprofit Research Collaborative Fundraising Effectiveness Project will calculate retention rates on a national basis. So NRC reports that 63% of organizations renew 60% or more of their donors, but the Fundraising Effectiveness Project reports that half of all organizations report a renewal rate of only 39% or even less. And so what does that tell us? We're losing far too many of our donors, and we're spinning our wheels. And so as you calculate your own donor retention rate, use 60% and 39% as a benchmark to see where you fall. But I can tell you this, as you start to break down major donors between middle-level donors and lower-level donors, for your major donors, you should shoot for a 90% donor retention rate. For your middle-level donors, you should shoot for an 80% retention rate. And your lower dollar donors, like a 60% rate. And sometimes with events, you only have like a 30 or 40% rate, because with events, it's like, oh, do I buy a ticket this year or not? Or my company bought a table. So special events always, their retention rate tends to be lower. So please don't do this. This, again, is from an actual organization. I changed the names of the foundation, but their current year budget was 25 for the ABC Foundation. Their current year actual 25. Okay. Their budget for the XYZ Foundation was 75, but their current year actual was 50. The Smith Foundation, they budgeted $15,000, but that grant was still pending. The Jones was the same. And then they had a line item in their budget called New Foundations to be Determined. Now, if any of you on this webinar use to be determined in your budgeting, I want you to do a pinky promise, a virtual pinky promise with me right now to never have to be determined in your budgets ever again. 40 grand of to be determined is a lot of money. So they've already lost 25,000 with the XYZ Foundation, and there's 30,000 pending, and 40,000 isn't even set up yet. That's $95,000 that may not come in. That's their foundation side. On their corporate side, they had 10 from the bank, the big bank, they got 10. They had 7,500 budgeted, that was pending. They had a new company budgeted at 5, they only got 1,500. They did get 3 from a smaller company. Another company, they got 1 instead of 3. And then again, they had a line item for to be determined for sponsorships. They were going to raise 50 grand in sponsorships, and so far in that fiscal year, they'd only had $1,500. So again, these huge swings in numbers. So I want you to promise me never have to be determined in there, have realistic budgets. And so this is where the probabilities come in. This is what it should look like. Here's that same ABC Foundation, prior year actual 25, current year ask 25. Probability is 100%, we got 25. The XYZ Foundation, prior year was 50. Okay, this year we're going to ask them for 75, right? There's nothing wrong with asking for a donor to increase from 50 to 75. But I don't want you to budget at 75. I want you to sit down and think, okay, probability. How likely is it that we're going to get an increase from 50 to 75? In this example, I put it at a 60% chance of getting that increase, which means that I'm only budgeting for 45. The Smith Foundation, we got it. The Jones Foundation, we're asking them to go up more. There's a 75% chance there. Then here's all these. Remember this slide back here? It had to be determined. Well, in this slide, instead of having to be determined, I actually have names of actual prospects. So the Kelly Foundation, the Sally Foundation, Millie and Billy. Okay, so those are my 4 prospects. Prior year actual is 0 because they are prospects. The current year ask amount, which is what we think we would like to ask them to give. But then look at my probabilities. 40% chance, 20% chance, 10% chance, 5% chance. So then I'm only budgeting a few $1,000s on these prospects rather than budgeting, 30-some thousand on these prospects. So again, it's not bad to think about prospecting. It's not bad to think about asking your current donors to give more. But don't budget on that hope and that dream and that wish. So on the corporate side, here's our big bank and our corporate headquarters. New company, again, no to be determined here. New company, small company, happy company, and a super sponsor. And you can see what the probabilities are. So at the end of the day, after this exercise, my prior year actual was 122. My ask, what I think I'm going to ask every one of these potential donors to give, 203,500. But my budget amount is 127,000. So my budget went up by 5,000 rather than my budget going up by 20,000. So this tool, so donor retention rate, average gift size, and now probability, and this probability works really well with foundations and corporate. It can also work really well with your major individual donors. I do not recommend trying to do probability with every single donor on your donor list. That just takes too much time. That's why average gift is a great handy tool, because you're going to take a summary, take a data point that's like, okay, here's our average, and you're going to extrapolate that over a whole entire list of donors. But with grants, I like using probability. So what is probability? Probability is the measure of how likely an event is to occur over the number of possible outcomes. So you're using logic and reason, even though there's some degree of uncertainty. So probability equals events over the number of outcomes. I'm going to take you real quickly down here to a website, and this link is in the presentation. So it's a wiki. It's a WikiHow. So this shows you the probability of calculating something. So this first example 1, what's the likelihood of choosing a day that falls on the weekend when randomly picking the day of the week? Well, choosing a day falling on the weekend is your event. The number of possible outcomes days in a week is 7. Or a jar contains 4 blue marbles, 5 red marbles, 11 white marbles. What is the odds of pulling a red marble? Here's what it looks like. The day of the week, well, if you want to pick a weekend day, there's 2 weekend days per week out of 7 days per week. Divide that out, you have a 28.57% chance of picking a weekend day. How many marbles are there? There's 5 blue marbles out of total of 20. You have a 25% chance of pulling a blue marble. We won't, it gets even, this article goes on and on and on, but that gives you a quick glance at what does it mean to calculate probability. Again, it doesn't have to be overly complicated. I want this to be simple for you. The other part on probability that I want to share. So here's the link to that article I just showed you, that little WikiHow. The probability of getting a grant from the ABC Foundation. Getting a grant is the event. The number of grants that they award per grant cycle is the outcome. Oops, sorry. So you are applying for 1 grant. They give out 20 grants per cycle. You have a 1 out of 20% chance of getting that, right? But here's the limitation with this math. And so I don't want you to think like this math has to be super complicated. The difference in calculating that probability of pulling a red marble out of the jar is that there's no variables. There are X number of marbles in the jar. Your odds of picking a red one equal Y, and there's no variation. But when we try to use probabilities with grant writing, this math does not account for the relationship factors. So that is why when I calculate probabilities for foundations and corporate grants and sponsorships based on that transactional level and the relationship level. So how well does the funder know you? Have they given to you in the past? Do you have a board member affiliation? Did they invite your application? How many conversations have you had with that foundation? Or is this just some new prospect that you found online and you've never worked with them before? So if I go back, I'm going to go back a screen to this one. So these probabilities, we can calculate in the way I just showed you. So say the Kelly Foundation gives 20 grants per quarter. We're one of those 20 grants that they renew, or one of the 20 applications that they're renewing, and here's our number. But what you can see here, the Kelly Foundation, I did a 40% probability. Sally Foundation, I did 10%. Millie at 10, and 10, and then the Billy Foundation at 5%. So you could say to me, all right, Kerri, why do you have different probabilities in there? How did you calculate that? Well, this is what I had just said about relationship. Well, the Kelly Foundation, I've met with them in person, and I've talked to them on the phone twice, and I feel like there's a good relationship there. That's why I think that's a 40% chance over the Sally Foundation, where I haven't had the chance to meet with them in person. Or you know, the Happy Company down toward the bottom. Why do I think I have a 75% chance of getting that request from the Happy Company? Well, because someone who works at the Happy Company sits on my board. So that's why this probability math here, do the math, but do here what I have in bold. Think about your relational aspects. How close are we to this funder? And it really comes down to a gut check. Don't get caught up in getting the exact number. It's an educated guess. It's a gut check. It's based on your work with them. It's based on your history, so that you get it right.
Hey, Kerri.
So
Hey, Kerri, it's
yep.
Christy. So we have a question, right, while you're talking about probability. Let's go ahead and answer it while you're here.
Okay.
On the Ohio Arts Council's Art Start application, it requires income and expenses to equal. This makes the probability of what will be awarded by different funders difficult. The amount gifted is based on a score. You need to ask for X amount and expect Y amount. So you've done lots of OACA grants. Do you have any advice on that?
Yeah, so guess it, right? So there's a panel that's going to score you, and you feel like that is totally out of your control, and to a certain extent it is, other than the words on the page and the numbers in your budget. You can go back and look at what were your scores in previous years. You know, OACA, I believe still, Christy, right, reports out what your score was.
That's right. That's right. Although this year we've changed the scoring a little, so it's not going to be apples to apples.
But you can go back over your history and say, well, for the last 10 years, our average score has been 89. And our average gift, if you're comparing operating support or project support, our average gift has been Y. And so that's how you factor it in. You have to look at your history, you have to look at your relationship, and really it's a best guess. It's an educated guess. It isn't a just pull the number out of the sky guess. It's okay. Our score typically ranges from this to this. Our grants have ranged from this to this. The average of those is X. I feel like this year our program is different and new and innovative. They might score us a little higher. So that's how I would run it.
Great. Thank you.
Yep. So some more data to help you. Giving USA, I'm going to assume many of you know about Giving USA. Every year they report on charitable giving in our country. Individuals gave 72% of all charitable gifts. Bequests, what's left in a will or someone's estate, is 8% of giving. Foundation grants were 15%. Corporate support was only 5%. When you factor in, a lot of foundations today are family foundations. In fact, it's the growing segment in foundations. With bequests, which of course is a gift from an individual who's passed away, individual giving is up to 87%. So I always say to my clients, are you spending 87% of your time building individual giving in your organization? And so that's a great question to pose. And if you're spending 87% of your time trying to get corporate sponsorship or 87% of your time writing foundation grants, I'm going to say the data doesn't back you up. You might have to rethink how you structure your time, because really individual giving is the lifeblood of charitable giving in our country. So the Nonprofit Research Collaborative, this is one of the handouts for you. I wanted to share that 63% of charities reported growth, which is the largest growth since 2007. 73% of nonprofits met their fundraising goal in 2014, which is up from 59% the year before. And for all my arts friends who are on this, I love this one. The arts saw the highest share of respondents reporting an increase. It's 70%, which is significantly higher than the 52% increase in 2013. And in 2013, the arts was the lowest of all the subsectors. The most frequently used fundraising method, according to the Research Collaborative, is major gifts, foundation grants, board giving, corporate grants, and gifts and direct mail. They all saw increases. And this, again, this report's in the handout. So in the end, I want to say this to each of you. You have power. There's positional power. If you are the CEO or the CFO, or maybe you're the Vice President of Development, your position gives you a certain amount of power. But I also want you to know, regardless of your title, you have personal power. It doesn't matter to me what your title is. Use your power with what we've talked about today to add to your organization's budget conversations, especially if you're one of those, 1/3 of you who said, we don't even budget at all. Or even if you feel like you budget but you still fill in the gap and work backwards. You have power. So please do not feel like, well, I'm just the development coordinator or I'm just the grant writer. Use this knowledge today to feel empowered to go to your vice president, your CEO, your CFO and say, we've got a new fiscal year coming up. I'd like to try to do this analysis. Because creating realistic budgets based on actual giving history and probabilities creates an environment for success. It gives you a roadmap, you know the math, and throughout the fiscal year, you can measure against your math assumptions to see where you land. And honestly, it's a powerful tool. So we've got time now too. Christy, we can open it up for some more questions.
Yeah, absolutely. So you have a couple options here. You can click the raise your hand feature on the control panel and I can unmute you. And Kerri, I'm going to do that for Dennis O'Connell because he's typed in a question that I don't exactly understand. So Dennis, I've unmuted you. You want to ask Kerri your question directly? Dennis O'Connell. Hello? So I'm not sure, Kerri. I'll try to interpret. But that may not apply to individual organizations. How do the national figures, I think his question is, how do the national figures apply to individual organizations? And how important is history?
Well, the national figures give you a benchmark. It's like a temperature. It's a gauge. So here, well, I'll go back. So if you are not experiencing growth in your charitable giving, if you're not meeting your fundraising goal, you can look at this data and say, well, 73% of our peers did meet their fundraising goal. Or if you didn't feel like you had an increase in your arts funding, well, 70% of our peers did. So these are these kind of touch points, benchmarks to measure against your own work. And they report, the NRC reports this work every 6 months. So especially during the recession when the arts were hit big time, it's powerful to say, okay, what's happening? I know what's happening in my organization, but what's happening in the field? So using this national report gives you data. So if your board says to you, okay, we're going to try to grow contributed income, by 150%, you can say, hold on, let me tell you what's happening nationally. Of course, there's variables for your local community, but I find that data is your friend, and whether it's national data or local data, it gives you information to help you plan and budget.
Great, thank you. Another question, Kerri. I think the idea of, quote, fill the gap is very hard to overcome. Can you suggest a first few steps to begin to alter this kind of thinking?
Yep. So the first way to do it is go back to the spreadsheet and crunch the numbers and say to your leadership, okay, do we know 325 people who can give us $125 each? Data is powerful. And so if you have had a fill the gap mentality at your organization for years, it will be hard. I'm not going to tell you this is easy. It will be hard to say, I want to do this differently, but you can't argue with the numbers. Here, I'll go back, everybody, to the spreadsheet. Pardon clicking through really quickly. You cannot argue with the numbers. If you are confident in what your donor retention rate is, if you're confident in your average gift size, and you plug and chug, and you come up with, okay, you're telling us to fill the gap, we need to raise $50,000, but I'm telling you, based on the current donor base, we're only going to raise $26,250 in renewals, which means we have to come up with $23,750 in new money. And based on that average gift, that means we need 317 people to do that. And then pause. And let your leadership team come to their own conclusion. The data doesn't lie, and it takes the emotion out of it. It isn't you saying, hey, I'm really busy, I'm overworked, I'm only one development person, we're a small shop. It isn't saying any of that. It's saying, here's the numbers. And the numbers tell the story, and they take a lot of the emotion out of it, and it's not about personality, it's about data. And then you can play with it. You can say, okay, well then maybe our goal is to increase donor retention from 70% to 80%, or from 70% to 90%. And if we do this, this is what the numbers look like. But then everyone has a very clear understanding of what their marching orders are. And if you have a very low donor retention rate, then you can say to your executive team, your leadership team, our number one priority is to increase donor retention. And to increase donor retention, we have to increase stewardship, we have to build engagement, and that takes human resources. So don't ask me to crank out 15 grant proposals to foundations that we have no relationship to, but do ask me to make 15 phone calls to donors that we lost last fiscal year that had given to us the year before. And I'm telling you, that is time well spent. And your leadership team should see it. If they don't see it, feel free to give me a call. I'll talk to them. And if they don't see it after that, right, then you have some serious soul searching about, do you want to continue to work in that environment? Because it's nearly impossible to fill the gap year after year after year, and sometimes you do it for 1 or 2 years, but you burn out.
So, Kerri, that relates to another little question. You might tie this in. How do you figure reduction in development staff or organizational staff back to donor retention? So the return on investment question, right?
Yeah. So say you go back to your office after this webinar and you crank out your donor retention rate between FY13 and FY14, and then calculate it between FY14 and FY15, and then calculate it again between FY15 and FY16, and see if there's a trend. If you had major budget cuts and you lost 1 or 2 development people, does it show in your donor retention numbers? And I'm gonna guess that it does. And again, that's more data to say, look, we made cuts in development, and look what's happened to our development retention. Look what's happened to our donor retention. Look what's happened to our contributed income budget. You can't build relationships and do stewardship and engagement if you don't have people to do it. Now you can have volunteers with help as well, sure. it's a human resource allocation, paid or volunteer. But if you've had your development department decimated because of budget cuts, or maybe just from attrition because your former development director was burned out and quit, and you went for 9 months without a development director because your marketing director was wearing 3 hats, or all the crazy town stuff that happens in our daily lives, run the numbers and show them the numbers don't lie.
Great. Let's do another one or two. Kerri, we're almost at 2:30. How do we best forecast anonymous donors? My organization accepts donations in lieu of ticket prices, so many of those that come in cash with no donor data.
So if you accept donations in lieu of ticket prices, then you need to just calculate your average. So in FY13, we had X number of anonymous donors give a donation instead of buying a ticket. In FY15, we had Y number of people make a donation instead of buying a ticket. And look at your trends and just extrapolate. On average, we get $10,000 a year from people who give us gifts rather than buy a ticket. And so we're going to estimate that we're going to get, maybe we'll be conservative, we'll estimate $7,500 last year. You don't know who they are, so you can't run, probabilities of this donor versus that donor, but you can look at trends and you can look at averages.
Great. And then there's also a real quick question too about a special event or special campaign like a capital campaign.
Yeah.
And being careful. I think it's about not distorting your data, right, and keeping apples to apples.
That's why I like running multiple spreadsheets. So you should have a capital campaign spreadsheet that pulls out those donors from your operating. So yes, you have to make sure that you don't have some anomalies in there. You have to make sure that you are comparing apples to apples. So when you're looking at donor retention from an individual giving standpoint, make sure it's operating gifts from FY13 to FY14, operating gifts from FY14 to FY15. Pull capital campaign gifts out. That should be cranked and crunched separately.
Great. We've come to most the end of our questions. There were a couple of questions about actual systems to use, Salesforce or other kinds of donor databases. I actually know there's some data out there that sort of compares all of those. Do you know a good source for that?
So I've never used Salesforce, so I'll tell you I have a bias though, because that was built for for-profit sales. And so my bias is I can't stand it when folks think about development and fundraising and philanthropy from a lens of sales. So that's just my bias. Salesforce might be a fine tool, but I kind of cringe at the thought of that because you're not closing deals, you're not selling X product, you're trying to build relationships. So there's a couple that are really inexpensive, like DonorSnap. If you have less than 1,000 donors, DonorSnap is only $39 a month. Blackbaud, Razor's Edge is at the high end. If you're a small shop, you do not need something as sophisticated as Razor's Edge. There's Donor Perfect. But if you go to the Association of Fundraising Professionals website, it's afpnet.org, I believe. They have a resource center, and a lot of the resource stuff is free. So you can check out material there. I also like, Christy, the one that does Giving Tuesdays at the charity. What's the one that does Giving Tuesday? Network for Good.
Network for Good.
If you go to the Network for Good website, I'm sure will have some ideas and counsel on databases. I do recommend you get a web-based database so that any of your senior leadership team can log in from home or wherever. Don't get something that's fixed licensed software on one computer. Get a web-based system. Make sure it has backup capabilities so that your data is being backed up somewhere securely and often. But you don't have to spend a lot of money, and DonorSnap is $39 a month. So.
Great. Great, thank you. All right, so we're just at 2:30, so we're gonna wrap up. The slide you're looking at now is a little promo for our next webinar, which will be taught by yours truly. Lions, Tigers, and Boards. Oh my! This is a workshop I've done several times live and as a webinar. We'll kind of hit the top 10 roles and responsibilities for high-performing nonprofit boards, and watch your email for registration information soon. And with that, Kerri, pop up your last slide. I know.
So this is a this is a quote from Peter Drucker and I just love this quote. So you just gave an hour out of your day to spend some time thinking about budgeting. So follow that effective action with quiet reflection, because from quiet reflection will come even more effective action. So if you're the person who posted about how do we overcome the fill the gap budget culture that you've been working in, give yourself some time and think through it, and I promise there'll be even more effective action because you've been thoughtful. And then my contact information is there with any questions. Don't hesitate to give me a holler.
Great. I know Kerri is very giving of her time and expertise, so take her up on that and shoot her an email with additional questions. We got to most of them that I saw. So thank you, Kerri, for doing this webinar for us today. We really appreciate it. Really great information for the field. Thank you to those of you who joined the webinar today. We hope you found it really valuable and some information you can put to use yet today. And when you get to your email this afternoon, please click on our survey link and give us a little feedback so we can continue to make these sessions better and better for you. And with that, have a terrific day.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Christy.
Thank you, Kerri. Bye-bye.
Bye.